Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone to the Boston Network for International Development Spotlight. We're talking today about human-centered responses to the global refugee and migrant crisis. My name is Nanako Tamaru, and I am the Executive Director of BNID. I'll go ahead and stop sharing so I can see everyone that's in the virtual room. And at BNID, we partner with many of your universities that are in the room today in a program called Advancing International Development in Higher Education. And so it's just as what the program name sounds. Our goal is to help students who are interested in international development, both as kind of an academic pursuit, perhaps a career pursuit, to help you figure out what is international development, what are the many different types of things within international development, this being a super deep dive specifically into forced migration and displacement. We also do career panels and have other programs around connecting with professionals in the field, which I'll share at the end about what our next event is. It's coming up in a couple of weeks. But the purpose of these workshops or webinars is really to help you, students, and community members to better understand what is international development, what are some interesting topics within international development today, and how we can learn more together and help support these important causes. So today we're joined with three amazing speakers who work in this area and who are experts in their own right. I'm so excited to hear about kind of what they're seeing, what they're doing, and just to learn more alongside all of you. And today, again, we're going to be talking about forced migration and displacement and kind of the trends that we're seeing all around the world, what organizations are doing to support refugees and displaced communities, and would love to hear questions from you all as well. So let's go ahead and kick it off. We've got three awesome speakers joining us today. We have Johannes, Zach, and Jezabel. And I'll let each of them introduce themselves. Johannes, why don't we start with you?
Unmute myself. Hi, everybody. My name is Johannes Davies. I'm a programs officer with Concern Worldwide US. We are an office associated with Concern Worldwide, which is an Irish INGO that operates in 25 countries around the world. And most recently, I was seconded to support our cross-border mission from Chad into West Darfur from about October until the end of January.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And Zach, let's go with you.
Sure. Thank you. Hi, my name is Zach Gross. I'm the Associate Director of Deployment Programs for Refuge Point. It's a Boston-based NGO that has a urban refugee protection program in Nairobi, Kenya, and a deployment program where we deploy experts technical experts in resettlement, child protection, and complementary pathways around the world to different UNHCR offices. Super glad to be here and excited to participate.
Zach and Jezabel, over to you.
Hello, my name is Jezabel. I am an international graduate student at WPI, a Worcester Polytechnic Institute. WPI is a STEM institution, so really focused on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But we do have a department that is called Social Science and Policy Studies. And that department has a program that is called Global Development, which is where I'm doing my master's. So my master's degree is in Global Development at WPI.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's just great to get to know each one of you and really look forward to hearing more about the work that you do. But before we kind of jump into that, I was wondering, Zach, if you could kind of help us set the scene. For some folks in the room, this might be the first time that they're hearing about forced displacement or migration. So maybe you could, and why it's happening, right? And why it's happening globally, right? It's affecting many different countries, many different communities. So maybe you can help us kind of ground us in, what is this global crisis that we're seeing? What are the different types of communities that are being displaced? Just help us to kind of set the scene for this discussion.
Sure, happy to, and also invite the other colleagues on the panel to jump in case I miss anything. So forced displacement generally refers to those people displaced by war, persecution, violence, and human rights violations. And displacement can occur within the borders of one's own country or across borders. It's projected that by the end of September of this year, there will be more than 114 million people globally who have been forcibly displaced. Generally, forcibly displaced people fall under three categories: internally displaced people, asylum seekers, and refugees. And I could take just a minute to define these. Those individuals who've been forced to leave their home, but who remain within their country's borders, are known as internally displaced people. An asylum seeker is someone who has crossed an international border and is seeking international protection as a refugee. Not all asylum seekers will be found to be refugees, but all refugees were once asylum seekers. And lastly, a refugee is an individual who has crossed an international border and is unable or unwilling to return to their home country, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. This is in line with the 1951 Refugee Convention, although some regions have broadened their definitions of a refugee. So after a refugee flees their home country, they're usually left with three basic solutions, which are often referred to as durable solutions. The first is return home when conditions are safe, and that's usually called repatriation. They can remain in their current host country and eventually become citizens. That's local integration. Or some are able to resettle to another third safe country, and we call that resettlement. Currently, the refugee crisis is outpacing solutions. The number of displaced people keeps growing annually, and actually climate change is accelerating the growth and pace of displacement. So those who are displaced and are remaining in host countries are generally, we're seeing that they're staying in these host countries for longer periods of time. 80% of all refugees are displaced on an average for 10 to 25 years. And the system set up to provide solutions for refugees is unable to keep up with these numbers. In recent years, less than 3% of refugees are able to get resettled to a third country, return home, or legally integrate into their host country. So that's leaving around 97% of forcibly displaced people in a state of limbo. And the displacement crisis is leaving millions without opportunities to provide for themselves and to rebuild their lives. Thanks. Yeah, over to you.
Sure, thanks, Zach. I mean, there's like so much to unpack there, but maybe I'll just ask, Johannes, Jezabel, anything to add? I know that Zach, your organization works a lot with refugees, so really appreciate kind of the nuance that you've added there. But Johannes, Jezabel, anything else to add? I mean, we'll be talking about this for the next hour, but anything else to add in terms of like setting the scene and to help us understand like what is displacement?
Yeah, I would say that one thing to add there is perhaps this kind of emerging trend of mixed flows in transit, where all of these people that Zach mentioned are more frequently traveling together and moving across borders. So this is, and we are now seeing more and more routes in Europe, America, and I can talk about that later when I discuss about my research. But I do think that there's this interesting trend where we are seeing more people going into these routes, and they are traveling together in these mixed flows where you have economic migrants, but you also have asylum seekers, and you also have refugees, and so those lines become blurry when we're talking about people traveling together in mixed flows. So an emerging trend that I think it's quite interesting to add to that.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. Johannes, anything to add?
Yeah, I think that both Zach and Jezabel did a fantastic job going over what is forced displacement and the legal sort of conventions behind them. One thing I would just want to reiterate that Zach mentioned is the fact that most forcibly displaced people today are IDPs. That's to say they're displaced within the borders of their own country. And then, once they leave that country, as Zach already highlighted, a huge number don't actually enter the legal mechanisms of seeking refugee status and are often left in states of limbo because of harsh asylum laws or inability to register. And that's just something I want to highlight as well.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to note that a lot of times some of these numbers that we're stating, they're not always reflecting that the true and full picture of the number of people impacted, right? The number of registered refugees does not equate to the number of refugees that exist in the world, and that we're getting kind of a snapshot of the numbers that we think. But I mean, the important takeaway is that millions, hundreds of millions of people are affected, and that the movement of people is cross countries, cross continents. It's when you really, I see it coming up more and more in the news, especially since we're in an election year. We hear a lot about immigration, particularly at the U.S. southern border. But we're still seeing it in the news a lot about, migration flows to Europe. We're hearing about internally displaced people, IDPs, in Palestine, for example. Like these are issues that are happening all over the world to people from many, many different contexts, whether, again, as Zach mentioned, whether that's conflict like in Palestine, or climate related, whether that's famine or food shortage, or we have economic migrants. Like, there's so many reasons why people are moving. I'd love to kind of transition a little bit to, now that we've talked about kind of what is displacement, why are people moving, would love to hear more about specifically the type of work that you all are doing in this space. Like, how are you and your organizations helping to support these individuals? At the end of the day, these are individuals, these are humans, people who are doing these really tough journeys, leaving their homes, which is such a hard decision to do, under duress. Would love to hear more from you all about, what type of work you're doing, where you see the needs are, and how organizations like yours are supporting these individuals. So how about Johannes? Let's go with you first to talk a little bit about Concern Worldwide.
Sure. So I think, as I mentioned in my introduction, Concern is an INGO. We're based out of Dublin primarily, although we have offices in New York. And then we operate in 25 other countries as well. And we primarily target countries that are among the poorest or most vulnerable, based on indicators, political situations, and the level of need required. We do not work directly within the refugee resettlement system. Obviously, a lot of our programs do interact with agencies around the refugee system, UNHCR, IOM, these organizations. But we implement multi-sectoral activities across those countries, often in the regions that have been affected by conflict or massive displacement recently. This is across a huge range of sectors, depending on the context and where we feel we have the expertise and where there are gaps that we can address effectively. But in brief, I would probably break them into 6 categories loosely. Climate change, addressing climate change and climate change resilience, emergency response and working with displaced people and refugees, a lot of health and nutrition work. Concern is very well known for its nutrition work and its health work as well. And so that's a major area of implementation for us in most of our countries. We also do a lot of livelihoods and financial empowerment work. And then we also obviously do education and gender equality work. I mean, and the amount of activities that can fall into those quite broad sectors is massive and very context specific. One thing I will sort of harp on about Concern about that I really value is Concern places a huge importance on accountability to affected populations and having effective complaint and response mechanisms. And that's just to say that we try to meet these people in the places where they are and try to address the needs that they say that they have, building participatory design. And so as a result, most of our work is with either forcibly displaced people or with IDPs. Speaking specifically, for example, about my experience being seconded to our Sudan team at the end of last year, I was working primarily in West Darfur. And so we were working with IDPs in that area. We support about 80 health facilities in Sudan. We're operating in West Darfur and in Kordofan. And in those areas, we're supporting with capacity building at health facilities, doing outpatient therapeutic programs, working with stabilization centers, MUEC screenings. Sorry, I realize I'm getting quite technical. So we have teams that will go out and basically do or work with local government health partners or local NGOs to go out and do screenings on nutrition, and if necessary, refer them within the health system or to other partners. And then we support the different levels of the health systems to try and build local capacity and make sure basics are there. In Sudan, drugs, there's like a huge shortage of drugs. There's a huge shortage of what we call RUTFs, which are used to feed children who are severely malnourished. So yeah, a lot of management of acute malnutrition, MAM work. And so that's primarily what we were doing in West Darfur, as well as it's an emergency. So distributing NFIs, everything from pots and stoves and mats and tents to mosquito nets, because an IDP often has fled and has had to leave with nothing. And so this can make a huge difference, even quite a small delivery, quite a small distribution. So I hope that broadly answers the question.
Yeah, and just a follow-up question is, you mentioned kind of that you have a participatory approach. Can you tell us a little bit more about kind of what that looks like in practice, and why a participatory approach is important, or why you guys have chosen to prioritize it?
Absolutely. I think the person best placed to tell you what will impact them positively is the person receiving services. And I think that's pretty self-explanatory for me personally. So before we implement any programs, or before we even want to go to a donor with a design, we'll make sure that we're consulting with members of the community all across the range. That's to say, we're speaking to women, we're speaking to elderly people, we're speaking to youth, we're speaking to pregnant and lactating women, people with disabilities, as well as community leaders, as well as local government officials, as well as other INGO partners and local NGO partners, to make sure that everyone is involved in the design. If a community says that they don't need additional irrigation, but they need seeds, and you show up with irrigation, that's not hugely helpful. Or maybe it is, but seeds would be more helpful. And so listening to the communities, I think, is hugely important. And that's what it is. I mean, it's going out and speaking to communities, asking them what services are required, how would they best be delivered, who can we target? And this is necessary throughout the program process. I mean, once you've identified what you want to do, you have to identify people. Like, what criteria are you establishing for people to access these services? Unfortunately, we're not always able to do blanket services. So you have to establish sort of eligibility criteria. What are those looking like? How do you sensitize the community on that? Can the community agree that these are the criteria? We don't want to raise tensions. Who is best placed to help you develop those lists and furnish those lists of who are the vulnerable members in a community? It's probably community members and people integrated into it already. And then once you have those lists, you have to go out and verify those lists and make sure that the people that they're telling you have XYZ, issue, and therefore fit the eligibility, do in fact meet those criteria. Once you've done the distribution, you have to go out and ask them what they spent the money on. Were they pleased with the service? What could we improve upon? Was it timely? Was it safe? Was it sufficient? So throughout the process, we're constantly going back to communities, asking for their feedback from all the way from design to post distribution monitoring. Yeah.
Thank you. That's really helpful to hear and to hear explained, and I think also links back to what you're talking earlier about accountability mechanisms. So not only getting the input from communities in the design phase, but then ensuring that, you know, so you don't need irrigation, but you do need seeds. Did we deliver the right seeds at the right time to the right people, right? Making sure to do that follow-up, to have that accountability, I think is so important for effective programs, right? To be able to hear from the folks in the community about what their needs are and how those needs are being met or not met. Thank you so much. Let's move to Jezabel. I know that for you, you were in Panama earlier this year doing research focused on understanding the challenges that humanitarian organizations experience while providing aid to migrants who are crossing in Darien. I wondered if you could tell us more about what those are and kind of what you saw in your research.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, I was in Panama earlier this year, back in January. And I guess the first thing that I have to say that is quite interesting about the case in Panama is that Panama has two groups of interest there. So there are migrants in transit. These are people on the move. And there are migrants and organizations there called them with vocation of permanence. So these are people who came to Panama since the early 2000s and are trying to settle there and want to make their life in Panama, but given a number of reasons and restrictive policies in the country, cannot have a defined status. So there are these two groups and they have very different needs. Migrants in transit, we're talking more about humanitarian needs, and then migrants with vocation of permanence, we're talking about durable solutions, as Zach mentioned previously. So right there's like a tension between the different groups of migrants that are kind of like coexisting in the country, and then those tensions are also like kind of like extrapolate to the organizations that are trying to provide assistance to those groups, right? And so Darien became a focus for migration because Darien is located in between Colombia and Panama, but Darien is like a jungle. There are no roads, there's no public infrastructure. And so since 2021, people have made the journey across Darien with two very interesting groups coming to Panama. We have what is called like regional migrants. So these are people from Colombia, Ecuador, Haiti, and Venezuela. But we also have extra-regional migrants who are coming to Darien. So these are people from Africa and Asia, mainly China, Afghanistan, and India. This is a very unusual phenomenon. It had never happened before in Panama, at least as it's happening now with these extra-regional groups. And so in 2021, there were more than 100,000 migrants in transit through Panama. The next year, the number doubled to more than 200,000. And then last year, 2023, 500,000 people crossed Darien. Panama is a country of 4 million people. So you might imagine the constraints that brought to the organizations providing a response there. And then, as I mentioned to you, most of the organizations there were used to provide this kind of like durable solutions, right? Type of assistance to migrants with vocation of permanence. So there was never, they were never providing this type of emergency or humanitarian assistance. So they really had to kind of like change to that the course of their work, right? To provide then to the needs of migrants in transit. Regarding the challenges, while I was in Panama, I was able to interview 18 humanitarian workers from different organizations, including UN agencies, international NGOs, local NGOs, and some other actors such as the church, because the church is very much engaged in the response down in Darien. And so they mentioned two in particular, and the first one that more than half of the people I interviewed told me is human resources. And this was very unexpected. One thing that is interesting about Panama as well is that Panama is one of 6 humanitarian regional hubs from the UN. So the UN has 6 hubs across the world, and one of them is located in Panama. So there is this sort of capacity for international humanitarian aid distribution from Panama to the countries, but then the capacities to distribute humanitarian assistance within didn't quite develop, right? So that's an interesting situation. And then what they told me then is like, we are lacking people who are specifically trained in humanitarian assistance. And what they were doing is that they were hiring people based on their potential more than their experience. And this has a couple of implications for the people that they are trying to help. One of them, for example, is that they told me most of our people on the ground are not really ready to provide psychological care or first aid to migrants who, as you might imagine, had just crossed the jungle, are coming in high distress, have experienced violence in many forms. And so that really brings challenges to the organizations trying to respond to people, right? Another thing that they mentioned to me, for example, is our personnel is not really prepared to de-escalate conflicts that happen on the ground. Again, like in Darien, we're talking about people who are queuing for food, queuing for health medical assistance, who are making long lines so they can be registered, have their biometrics taken. As I mentioned before, they come in highly distressed, they've experienced violence, so you might imagine that in that scenario, tensions may arise, and when the workers that are not prepared to handle the situations, it puts everybody at risk, including migrants themselves, but also like the teams that are working there and trying to distribute aid. And then another implication of this lack of trained human resources is that then it happens that there are certain people that might be left unprotected. So an example of this is that I was told, we might identify cases of children traveling alone, and maybe we don't have the available personnel to verify that this child is coming alone, or if they are traveling with somebody, how we can verify that that's a family member or another person. So that brings it really, that lack of personnel really bring constraints to the type of work that these organizations can do. And so the second challenge that they mentioned was coordination and at two levels. First with the government, and that's because the current approach to the migration crisis in Panama is one of security, meaning the view of the government is like, we need to make sure that migrants in transit leave as soon as possible. This is a security issue for us, but then humanitarian organizations are trying to see it in another way, right? So those two visions confront, and then that really makes it difficult for these two groups to coordinate, right? Like the government and the humanitarian institutions on the ground. And then there are issues of aid duplicity, which was a very, very interesting concept that I learned while I was there. And so aid duplicity it means that there are organizations providing the same type of aid to potentially the same type of people, and there's no means to verify who you're giving aid to, and that you're not duplicating that effort, and that your aid is going to as much people as possible. So those are some of the challenges, and there's definitely a challenge to optimize some processes on the ground. Organizations there do a lot of case referral. This means, like, for example, the organizations that are best prepared to handle children traveling alone will get cases referred from other organizations there. Organizations that know how to treat women who have experienced sexual violence will get cases. But this process of referring migrants in transit to the organizations that are best prepared to serve them happens really through informal channels. So through texting, through emails, through calls. And then there's also a risk of data privacy there. And so there are all of these challenges on the ground. And Panama is really an interesting case. So I can definitely expand on that later, but that's in a nutshell what I learned.
Well, I mean, thank you so much for sharing kind of your observations and your findings and your research. I think the examples that you shared just make it so concrete, just paint a picture of how challenging the context in Panama is to help folks who are coming through very quickly, kind of just crossing through the country. The coordination mechanisms that's challenging. It just seems like it's already, you're working with folks who are in a lot of distress, right? They've just gone, as you said, they've just gone through the jungle. They've been on a long journey, and some of the organizations are struggling with capacity or struggling to be prepared, or not be prepared, but perhaps it's have the right resources at the right time for the right people. Which I'm sure, we're getting a snapshot into Panama, but I'm sure these are similar challenges faced elsewhere. I'm going to come back to you with a follow-up question, I think, a little bit later on those challenges. But I also want to hear from Zach. So one thing that I'm hearing, which is interesting, is that, Johannes, you were talking about how Concern works with people who are often IDPs, people who need kind of that immediate assistance, perhaps that have recently left their homes and are in transit. Jezabel, you're talking about some folks who have traveled a very, very long ways, right, cross-continental, who are also some folks that are in transit, some folks that are actually trying to settle or have more durable solutions. And then Zach, coming to you and Refuge Point, if I heard correctly and remember correctly, a lot of your work is with refugees. So it's kind of an interesting perspective to get a little bit of kind of perspectives from organizations working with different people at different points in the process. But Zach, over to you. I'd love to hear more about Refuge Points, the work that you all are doing to help support refugees in particular.
Thanks. Yeah, Refuge Point works almost entirely with the refugees. Sometimes we assist in what we call the refugee status determination process, which is to adjudicate asylum seekers' cases to see whether or not they legally qualify as refugees. But mostly, we work. Our work is with refugees, and our organization kind of has two programmatic priorities. The first is what we call host country solutions. So that is trying to find solutions for refugees who are in their countries of asylum, where they have been given refugee status. And as I mentioned before, so many refugees don't return home, and so many refugees don't get the opportunity to be resettled. So this host country solutions work is really important. In our Nairobi office, we have this urban refugee protection program, and it takes a holistic approach towards realizing self-reliance. And so our programs have primarily been in the sectors of health, counseling. We do social work, outreach, and child protection. We also have a substantial livelihoods program that supports refugees to stabilize, build social and economic capital, and engage in dignified livelihoods so that they can meet their own essential needs. And the key word there is self-reliance, to be able to lift up refugees so that they're not relying on aid, but that they're able to live successful and dignified lives in their host countries. The other kind of priority area that Refuge Point works on is what we call third country solutions. And that is to help refugees who can't remain safely where they are to permanently and legally relocate to a safe new country and rebuild their lives there. This third country solutions is primarily done through what we call resettlement, but it's also done through what's known as complementary pathways. And complementary pathways is primarily family reunification, education pathways, and labor pathways. And these are legal avenues where refugees can relocate to new countries. So, for example, in complementary pathways, in our labor pathways, we are able to link refugees with employers in third countries to assist them in gaining employment and full residency and often nationality in the country where they're being hired to have a job. So one of our biggest employers that we've been able to work with are medical facilities in Canada. And the employers come to Kenya, and we've identified refugees, mostly urban and also camp-based refugees who have background in medicine and care, and we facilitate the interview process. And if selected, we do help facilitate the immigration process as well, so that they can move and relocate to Canada. But the majority of our third country solutions work is done through resettlement. And our resettlement program is both in Nairobi, but also around the world. So we support these refugees in 3 ways. Our Nairobi program, where our staff refer refugees directly to governments for resettlement and complementary pathways consideration. We have agreements with the United States government and the Canadian government to make direct referrals for resettlement. We also have a partnership with the UN Refugee Agency, the UN Refugee Agency, also known as UNHCR, where we deploy staff to UNHCR offices around the world and assist with the identification, screening, and processing of refugees who might be eligible for resettlement or complementary pathways. And in that case, our experts in 2023, we had experts deployed to more than 45 countries around the world, doing that technical work of identifying refugees, assessing their claims, writing and submitting their dossiers to third countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, and other European countries, where then the resettlement countries will make the final determination on whether or not to accept those refugees for resettlement. And then we've also launched what's called the Equitable Resettlement Access Consortium, where we work to expand NGO capacity globally to make resettlement referrals directly to the US, and that's the US Refugee Admissions Program. So in the past, almost exclusively all resettlement was done through UNHCR. And this is a new kind of way of looking at things, where we are supporting, instead of just it being kind of centralized within the UN, looking at how NGOs can identify and refer and submit cases for resettlement to the United States, and then ultimately up to the United States to adjudicate and decide whether or not to accept a refugee. But this is kind of changing the game, and like Johannes had said, this is also part of our localization effort to acknowledge that it's the community-based organizations, the refugee-led organizations, who know best, who know who are the people in need, what are the communities that we can support. And we believe that they play an extremely important role in the identification of refugees who could be submitted for resettlement. But also in Refuge Point's work, primarily in Nairobi, we also do really promote refugee-led and community-based efforts. And that's done in different ways. We have a refugee advisory committee that guides our work. They provide, and it's mostly our clients, they provide feedback and guidance on the services that we provide and support us in identifying the gaps, the challenges, and the weaknesses, and how we can improve. But we also do some coordination and capacity strengthening of other refugee-led organizations. And that also involves financial support. So while we are trying to provide direct support to refugees in Nairobi, we're also wanting to lift up different refugee-led organizations and support them in doing their work, because it's really them who know what the needs are and how to accomplish the needs, to accomplish their goals. but sometimes they just don't have that financial support or human resources to do so. So, and then, yeah, talking about challenges, there are definitely many, and those that Jezabel and Johannes had mentioned are certainly ones that we experience as well. I think one of the challenges that I'd like to highlight is a little more external, and a little bit more political, and that's about the climate these days around migration. And we're seeing that so many more states are becoming less and less willing to accept refugees for resettlement. And that's a problem, right? Because as I had said before, the crisis is growing and growing. There's more and more refugees, yet the resettlement space is shrinking and shrinking. So we know that less than 1% of refugees will be accepted for resettlement one day. And so while it's not necessarily the work of Refuge Point, we do need more advocacy efforts, states to have more generous policies and legislations that will lead to longer term and more durable solutions for refugees. And then it just occurred to me to talk a little bit more about the people who need protection. Because we talked about before those people who are escaping violence and conflict and persecution. And I just wanted to note that that can look like so many different things. It's not just people who are fleeing war, though obviously so many are, but people who are not safe in their own countries because of policies like discriminatory policies against LGBTQI, people who are activists where there's no freedom of speech. And so there's just a lot of different reasons why someone might flee their home. And in today's world, we just need more generous policies to support people because the issues are growing and that unfortunately the solutions are shrinking.
Thanks so much, Zach. And I appreciate that you brought in kind of the way that policies, and Jezabel, you mentioned this as well, like the way that the policies, right, in Panama, both for folks who are passing through or folks who are trying to settle, like the policies and laws really impact how services and how it can be provided and what support can be provided and what status these people have. And these policies shape in the United States. I mean, we see that as well. So I'm glad that you brought that up. Johannes, I wanted to come back to you. Both Zach and Jezabel have talked a little bit about kind of challenges, and Jezabel, I will come back to you to talk about kind of opportunities as well. But Johannes, I wanted to hear from you from your perspective, working with Concern Worldwide and the work that you do. What are some of the most pressing challenges, as well as kind of where are the opportunity areas to be able to strengthen the support for displaced communities?
Yeah. Well, first I would just reiterate everything Jezabel and Zach said. I could sit here and listen to them chat for hours. But for me, I think one thing, to build on Jezabel's point about human resources, I think that it's challenging for a lot of NGOs, INGOs, or local NGOs to operate because our funding levels are also so low in relative to the needs. I think Sudan is about 5% funding covered. I think Ethiopia is maybe 3 or 4%. DRC is maybe 14%. These are some of the biggest displacements we're seeing. Sudan, I think, has the most displaced people if you count internal and external displacements, and it's 5% funded. So how can we have the human capacity to address the needs if we're getting 5% of our requested ask? And that, beyond human resources, like most importantly, that means that we are not able to provide all of the services that are necessary and critical in Sudan at the moment. So I think funding is a huge issue, and that also goes into what Zach was saying, I think, about the current rhetoric and closing of borders, or sort of sense of isolationism, that we are not responsible for what happens outside. We are very, very much responsible. and it affects us all. From, I don't know, a moral, political, economic, pick a word perspective. That's very personal, but so I think funding is a huge challenge for us. The second one for us is access. Access can be very challenging in a lot of the areas where we operate. Obviously, you know, in areas where there's armed conflict or there's not necessarily a monopoly on violence, getting access and making sure you're working within the humanitarian principles can be a challenge. You know, in Sudan, for example, we have one office in Port Sudan, which is where the Sudanese armed forces sort of has set up its capital. But we're also operating in West Darfur, which is largely controlled by the Rapid Support Forces. In Haiti, where we operate, we have to negotiate with, you know, different actors for access to areas of Cité Soleil. But how do we do that while staying inside humanitarian principles, which is obviously massively important for us? Access is a challenge as well.
Thanks so much for sharing those challenges, and I think we're also hearing kind of some of the same themes among kind of what Jezabel and Zach have also shared. I do want to make sure that we can get to our Q&A. So this is an alert to all everyone in the audience that we are going to move to Q&A soon. So start thinking about what questions you might want to ask. But before we do, I'd love to go back to Jezabel. And Jezabel, you talked about so many of the challenges that folks are facing in Panama. And just wanted to hear, you know, from your research and from your discussions, like, were there any, you know, opportunity areas and ways to be able to strengthen that support in Panama as well?
Yes, definitely. And I do see an opportunity to build capacity as Zach organization is doing with local actors too. In Panama, one of the things that I've heard while I was there is somebody told me, like, what are we going to do when Darien is no longer a headline in the news? Like, what are we going to do when UN agencies leave? What are we going to do then? Like, what will be our approach? So local actors in Panama are very concerned about that, and I think there's definitely opportunities there to build capacity within local actors to have a change in policy too, because this security policy within Panama is also criminalizing other actors such as the church, and so then the capacity becomes even more constrained, right? So I think the Panama case, I think it's very interesting, as I mentioned before, because you have a UN regional hub for humanitarian aid right there in the country. So there is kind of like the international capacity to transfer that knowledge and to transfer resources and to transfer potentially technology that can help these organizations optimize their processes and so on. Obviously, I'm aware of the funding issues as well, right? But I do believe that there is an opportunity there to transfer capacities to the local actors down in Panama, so that when Darien stops being this headline, then people are able to handle this issue. And another thing is that I think this is even more important if we talk about how countries in the global south, like Panama, will probably become increasingly more responsible for holding these groups of people because of the policies in countries in the global north, right? So I think that might happen, but then the responsibility shifts towards countries in the global south, and so there will be a need to build that capacity, I believe.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you, Zach and Johannes, so much for sharing your perspectives, kind of the work that you're doing. It just sounds like it's such important work to do, and so much needed, you know, but just, Johannes, the numbers that you just said are like staggering to me. The idea that it's only, you know, 3% or 5%, and here's, you know, 14. Wow, that's so much more, but still like so underfunded, just highlights the kind of immense need there is, and the challenges to meet those needs. It's really, really, really staggering. But thank you guys so much for sharing all of your perspectives. I'd love to open it up to questions from the audience. Feel free to put your question in the chat, or you can raise your hand through Zoom. But I really would love to hear from all of you if you have any follow-up questions for our speakers. I know it can be scary to go to be the first one to ask the question. All right. Well, while you all are still thinking, pondering about, oh, well, there we go. We have our first volunteer question here. Ismail, please go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ismail. I'm a student in Bridgewater, taking masters in public administration. And my question is to Zach, because you're working close to home. I'm from Kenya, though not Nairobi, Kenya, Mombasa. Though you mentioned about well, let me put my video on. You mentioned about helping the refugees in the countries which they are, to help them resettle there rather than moving away. And I'm just wondering, what are some of the challenges when doing that, especially in countries, like most of the countries nowadays, including those in Africa, given that even my country has a little bit of hostility towards refugees and taking up the resources that they normally which are there. So what some of the challenges do you get to making them settle in those kind of countries rather than taking up opportunities to go to places like Canada and the USA? Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. And I'm a little less involved in the kind of that host country work, but I can try to speak to it. I think what's really important is also to ensure that programming involves the host community. And part of that is to foster good relationships between the refugee community and the host community. And sometimes that means also supporting the implementation of our programs to support the most at-risk members of the host community as well. And I believe that we are doing a little bit of that in Kenya, where we do work in some communities, and I believe we do support both the refugee population and some percentage of the host population. In the third country solutions work, one of the challenges that I've seen is actually been a little bit minor fraud, and where individuals from the host country might register or try to register as refugees and access resettlement. And that's where it's really important to have strong processes and anti-fraud mechanisms in place. Though I would say that that is not such a great problem. I don't think it happens too often. But yeah, I think there's really important work to be done in the fostering of the relationships between host countries and refugees.
Thanks so much, Ismail, and thanks so much, Zach. We've got a question from Haley, and Manal, I will get to your question next, but let's go to Haley. She's a graduate student at BSU, and she's asking, what countries have the best policies for refugees? Just in your knowledge, what countries have the best policies for refugees, and kind of if you could say a little bit about what those policies are or what makes them so good. But would be curious to know. Zach, this might be another question for you.
Sure. Well, I admire Canada, first of all. I think they are really generous in their refugee resettlement. But something that I really admire about Canada is their community sponsorship model, where it's not only that refugees can be identified and referred by the United Nations, but also a different pathway where communities within Canada can identify and sponsor both economically and socially refugees to come to Canada and resettle. And the reason why that's really great is because it increases the ability for the refugees to integrate. And it also engages the community in this resettlement. And I think in a way demystifies and destigmatizes refugee resettlement. And there are so many benefits to a community when a refugee is resettled. Some people think that it's always the community who's supporting the refugee, but no, so often the refugee is able to bring so many benefits to a community, economic benefits, social benefits. It goes both ways. And to see how community sponsorship works is really a great success. And that's why it's exciting that the US is piloting a community sponsorship program now. And we're really excited to see the impact that that has. In terms of host countries, we've seen some countries of asylum have very generous policies hosting refugees, and some are make it quite difficult for refugees to remain. Countries like that I've been to, like Zambia, Uganda, they have pretty generous policies where they have not only refugee camps, but in some instances, what's called refugee settlements, where they encourage refugees to build houses, farm, have plots of land. In some countries, they even provide pathways, I think like Zambia and maybe even Rwanda, pathways for refugees to apply for residency and freedom to work and freedom to move around. And so these are really important policies. Other countries make it a little bit more restrictive. There's what's called encampment policies, where refugees are not allowed to leave the refugee camps. They have no right to work. So refugees, they might be stuck in the country and they want to work and they want to be self-reliant and not rely on aid, but the host countries don't even allow them legally to work. So yeah, it's really encouraging to see when specific countries like Zambia, like Uganda, have really inviting policies for refugees.
Thanks so much, Jack. And I know we're over time, but we will just take 3 more minutes of your guys' time, and then we can sign off for the evening. But we have a question from Manal. I'll read from the chat. Johannes, I'm going to go to you with this one. Manal, they are an urban planning student at MIT, looking for internship opportunities, and just wondered if you had any advice. Interested in refugee resettlement, specifically the Middle East region. And any advice you have for people seeking internships in this space. Jezabel mentioned in the chat that the International Institute of New England, IINE, which is based here in Boston, does a ton of refugee resettlement. I was actually going to put their link in the chat, so it's so great you did that, Jezabel, already. So if you're interested actually in volunteering or interning, working with refugees who are resettling here in the US, IINE is a great resource. But Johannes, what kind of career advice would you have for folks looking for internships in this space?
Yeah, the only reason I was smiling during that is because Zach and Jezabel can probably guess what I'm going to say. I would strongly recommend taking a look at an organization called St. Andrew's Refugee Services. It's a refugee-led organization based out of Cairo. I worked there for several years. A lot of my colleagues and dear friends are now Zach's colleagues and presumably dear friends as well. It's a pretty phenomenal model. They operate only in Egypt, and like I said, it's a refugee-led organization. So something around I want to say 80 to 90% of staff are displaced people, are people who've been forcibly displaced. And they do a lot of resettlement and refugee status determination work, doing referrals directly to UNHCR's resettlement RSD or protection unit, as well as to other external partners. That's very specific to that. I can chat about STARS for ages. One thing I would just pull out though is I would encourage everybody, if you get the chance, to work at a smaller, if possible, national or local NGO at some point in your life. I think it's critically important that everyone understands what it is, the realities of implementing on the ground, of looking people in the eyes, the people you're providing services to, and understanding that like the models of INGOs, of UN agencies, is not the only model, and that last mile delivery is hugely challenging and hugely, hugely important. I also think there's a huge number of INGOs out there that do really, really good work. And definitely reaching out to people and chatting with them privately about how they feel about their organization is a huge resource. I think IRC does some amount of resettlement work out of New York. I would look that up, but I can't speak to it. Yeah, and then if I think of any others, I'll drop them in the chat.
Great, thank you so much. And I'll also say a little plug for our own events is that we are hosting an, I should say International Development Career Night, but BNID, as part of this program with your universities, is hosting a career night in Cambridge, where you can meet with professionals, Boston-based professionals who are working not just in migration, displacement, but also just the wide range of international development, public health, education. Like there's so many different spaces, peace building, conflict resolution. But that'll be a great opportunity again to ask more career questions, get some good connections for internships and jobs and things specifically in the Boston area. So definitely recommend you register for that. It's coming up on Thursday, April 4th. That's again in person in Cambridge. So that's coming up. And then I would also just say, you know, next academic year, we'll be doing more career panels and things talking about internships and jobs as well. So stay tuned to what BNID has to offer. Might get some good career advice there. But I just want to say thank you again to Jezabel, Johannes, Zach. Thank you so much for making the time today to share your knowledge and experience with us. I learned so much. I just really opened my eyes to kind of the stark need for support in this space, and just the really challenging nature of this work and the challenging environment that displaced communities are facing. So thank you so much for sharing today. I will share one last link in the chat. This is for our audience members. We take your thoughts and feedback to decide what types of events we put on, whether it's panel discussions like this, whether it's panels on careers and internships, whether it's in-person networking events. There's a link to the post-event survey here. Please share your feedback with us so we know what you want to come to, what you want to hear about, so that we can make more specific programming. It's like the same model that Johannes was talking about earlier, participatory design. You tell us what you want to see so that we can bring it to you. It's the same type of model, different context, but same type of model. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Really appreciate you sticking around these extra few minutes. And again, special thanks to our speakers. Really appreciate all of you and the amazing work that you all are doing. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, and stay in touch.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody.